By the time Mara Ellison brought the first sheep through the broken gate, most people had already decided the orchard was finished. No one had used that exact word on paper. The county assessor called it low-producing agricultural land. The man who inspected the irrigation lines called it a money pit. Her neighbor, Wade Mercer, was less polite. "Those trees are done," he told her. "You refeeding water to firewood." From the road, it was difficult to argue with him. The apple trees stood in uneven rows across 23 acres, their trunks gray and scarred, their branches thin enough to see sky through them. In spring, they still pushed out leaves, but the bloom had weakened year after year. By harvest, Mara might find only a handful of small, misshapen apples beneath trees that had once carried hundreds. The ground looked worse. Tall grass crowded the rows. Tough weeds climbed around irrigation risers. In the driest patches, the soil hardened into pale plates that cracked under her boots. Other areas stayed choked with coarse growth that returned almost as quickly as she cut it. Every solution cost money. Mowing cost diesel. Herbicide cost money. Mara did not want to spend. Fertilizer cost more every season. Labor cost more than all of them, and Mara had almost none of it left. That was why nearly 100 unwanted sheep standing behind temporary fencing looked so ridiculous. Old ewes with worn teeth, thin-bodied animals with uneven wool, a few limped. Some had stopped breeding reliably. Several had already been passed over by experienced ranchers who could not justify feeding them through another winter. To their previous owners, the calculation had been simple. They ate, they required fencing, they needed water, and they no longer produced enough lambs, wool, or weight to justify the expense. Mara understood the calculation. She simply looked at it differently. On the first morning, she did not turn all 100 animals loose among the trees. She fenced a narrow strip between several rows and moved only a small test group inside. The sheep hesitated. Then one stepped forward. Another followed. Within minutes, their heads were down. They clipped plants. Mara had been paying to mow. They grazed around trunks. They stepped through fallen leaves, and behind them, almost unnoticed, they scattered small, dark pellets across the orchard floor. Nothing dramatic happened. No tree suddenly bloomed. No dead branch turned green. No miracle appeared. But Mara noticed something she had not expected. For years, almost everything in the orchard had created another expense. Now the grass was feeding the sheep. The sheep were clearing the grass, and part of what they consumed was returning to the same ground. Wade watched from the fence that afternoon. He shook his head. "You bought a dying orchard," he said. "Now you filled it with useless sheep." Mara looked down the rows. She had no proof he was wrong. Not yet, but for the first time since buying the farm, something on those 23 acres was doing more than one job. And that was enough to make her keep watching. 3 weeks earlier, Mara had not been looking for sheep. She had been looking for a mower. The old tractor behind her barn had finally given up after coughing black smoke across half the orchard. The repair estimate was more than she had in the farm account, and hiring someone to mow 23 acres every few weeks would slowly bleed away what little money remained. Then she saw the notice. A rancher 30 miles north was reducing his flock before winter. Most of the good animals were already spoken for. Young ewes went first, healthy breeding stock went next. What remained stood behind a steel gate in a separate pasture. Nearly 100 sheep. When Mara arrived, the rancher, Dale Harlan, seemed surprised she wanted to see them. "You don't want those," he said. "Why?" He pointed through the fence. "Because nobody does." Some were old ewes whose best lambing years were behind them. Others were undersized. Several had poor fleece. One walked with a stiff rear leg. Another had worn teeth that made rough forage harder to handle. They were not worthless animals, but in a commercial flock, every mouth had to justify the hay it consumed through winter. Dale explained it without cruelty. Feed was expensive. Pasture was limited. Keeping an animal that produced little marketable return meant using resources that could support a younger ewe. Mara walked slowly along the fence. "What happens to them?" Dale shrugged. "Whatever makes economic sense." Then he noticed her orchard truck and smiled. "Don't tell me you're rethinking about taking them." Mara was, not because she believed she could turn old sheep into valuable breeding stock. She had another problem entirely. "What do they eat?" Dale laughed. "They re-sheep, I know. What do they eat when they not being fed hay?" His expression changed. "Grass, broadleaf weeds, whatever forage they'll take." Mara looked back at the flock. For months, she had been spending money to cut vegetation that grew for free beneath her apple trees. Here stood nearly 100 animals, whose biggest problem was that someone had to feed them. The contradiction was almost too obvious. Dale saw where her mind was going. "An orchard isn't a sheep pasture," he warned. "Leave them too long, and they'll make a mess. They go after things you don't want touched." Mara nodded. That mattered. She was not buying a miracle. She was buying one problem that might fit another. 2 days later, livestock trailers began arriving at her farm. Wade Mercer watched from across the road as the animals came down the ramps. Old sheep, thin sheep, a limping ewe. Animals experienced ranchers had already decided were not worth carrying. By sunset, almost 100 stood inside Mara's holding area and temporary fencing. Wade leaned against his pickup. "How much did you lose on this brilliant idea?" Mara closed the gate. "I haven't lost anything yet." He laughed. "You will when you start feeding them." That night, Mara stood at her kitchen window, looking toward the dark orchard. Wade believed she had just added 100 hungry mouths to a failing farm. Mara was beginning to wonder whether she had done something else. Maybe she had brought home 100 mouths capable of eating a problem she had been paying machines to fight. For the first few days, Mara watched the sheep more than the trees. She expected trouble, broken irrigation lines, damaged bark, escape attempts, anything that would prove Wade right. Instead, the small groups she tested inside the orchard settled into a rhythm. They moved slowly between the rows, heads down, cropping grass and broadleaf weeds from spaces Mara had been mowing for years. At first, that seemed useful enough. Less fuel, less time on the tractor, less money spent cutting plants that always grew back. But then Mara noticed something else. The problem in the orchard was not evenly spread. Some rows were nearly bare, others were buried beneath dense grass. In a few places, weeds stood waist-high around the trees. Elsewhere, the soil was so hard that rain ran across the surface before soaking in. Mara had always thought of the orchard as one failing piece of land. The sheep forced her to look at it differently, row by row, tree by tree, patch by patch. One afternoon, after moving a test group into a new section, Mara knelt beneath an old apple tree and pushed her fingers into the soil. The surface was dry. 2 inches down, it was cooler. Beside the trunk, a thick mat of grass roots occupied the same shallow zone where the tree needed moisture. That caught her attention. The trees were not standing alone. Everything beneath them was competing. Grass, weeds, roots, water, nutrients. For years, Mara had treated all that vegetation as something to cut. Now the sheep were turning part of it into something else. Feed. The idea stayed with her. The orchard was growing vegetation whether she wanted it or not. She could keep spending money fighting that growth. Or she could find a way to cycle some of it through the farm. Over the next week, Mara began carrying a notebook. She marked where the sheep grazed first. She noted where the grass was thickest. She checked where manure accumulated. She watched how each strip looked after the animals moved on. No single change was impressive, but small differences began stacking up where the sheep had passed. Dense competition around some trees was reduced. Fallen leaves mixed with light hoof disturbance instead of sitting untouched beneath a wall of weeds. Scattered across the surface were hundreds of small manure pellets. Mara knew better than to call any of that fertilizer magic. A few days of grazing could not repair years of decline, but the orchard suddenly made more sense. Plants beneath the trees had taken water and nutrients to grow. The sheep ate part of that growth. Then some of what they consumed returned to the ground in another form. It was a cycle, an imperfect one, but still a cycle. Wade found Mara kneeling in the dirt one morning. "You lose something? No, then what are you doing? Trying to figure out why some rows are worse than others." He glanced toward the trees. "They re-old, that's why, maybe." Wade laughed. "Trees don't care about theories." Mara brushed soil from her hands. "No, but they care about water." She looked down the row again. For the first time, she was beginning to understand that the dying orchard might not have one enemy. It might have dozens of small ones, and a flock of unwanted sheep had just shown her where to start looking. Mara had nearly 100 sheep on the farm, but when she began testing them seriously inside the orchard, she started with 12. Not because 12 was some carefully calculated number, because she did not yet trust what would happen if she released the entire flock among trees she could barely afford to lose. Just after sunrise, Mara fenced a narrow strip between 4 rows and moved 12 sheep inside. Then she stayed nearby with her notebook and watched what they chose to eat. They ignored some of the toughest stems. They stripped leaves from softer weeds. They clipped grass low enough that the ground beneath the apple trees became visible again. By noon, the contrast between the test strip and the neighboring rows was obvious. The ungrazed sections remained tangled with vegetation. The grazed strip looked different. Not clean in the polished way a mower left it, but worked, used, alive. Mara walked behind the flock. Hoof marks pressed lightly into the surface. Fallen leaves had been disturbed. Small manure pellets were scattered through the remaining grass. And unlike the tractor, the sheep had done all of it while feeding themselves. That was the part Mara could not stop thinking about. A mower performed one job. It cut vegetation. Then it stopped. The sheep were different. They removed vegetation by eating it. They moved across the land under their own power. The orchard floor provided part of their feed, and some of what they consumed returned to the same land. But Mara refused to mistake complexity for automatic improvement. Too much grazing could strip the ground. Too much trampling on wet soil could create damage. Too much time around young trees could lead the animals toward bark or low branches. 12 sheep could help. 100 badly managed sheep could destroy what little orchard she had left, so she treated the first paddock as an experiment, not proof. 3 days later, she expanded the test. 25 sheep, then 40. Each time she shortened the period they stayed. In one place she watched grass height, she watched the weather, she moved water troughs so the animals would not crowd the same location. And instead of asking how much vegetation they could remove, she began asking how much should remain when they left. Slowly, Mara started seeing the orchard differently, not as 23 acres that needed to be maintained, as 23 acres capable of producing something besides apples. The spaces between the trees were growing forage. She had simply never thought of that vegetation as a crop. Wade noticed the change, too. He parked beside the fence one afternoon and looked down the grazed rows. "I'll give you this," he said. "It's cheaper than mowing for now." He pointed toward the sheep. "But they still eating your farm?" Mara shook her head. "No." She looked at the strip they had just finished. "They eating what the farm was already growing." Wade frowned. There was nothing dramatic enough to argue with. No heavy fruit, no sudden transformation, only shorter vegetation, scattered manure, and a woman who had begun measuring value differently. The tractor had always treated the orchard floor as something to control. The sheep were forcing Mara to see it as something that could circulate, and once she saw that, she could not unsee it. The first real mistake happened after a week of rain. Until then, Mara had been gaining confidence. The sheep were eating down sections of the orchard floor, faster than she expected. The mower had stayed parked. Purchased feed had dropped slightly. The rows looked easier to manage, so when she reached the far western block, she made a decision that seemed harmless. She left the flock there too long. The ground was softer than usual, and that section carried thicker forage than most. Mara convinced herself that one more day would save her from moving fencing and water in the rain. By the next morning, the orchard looked different. Not better. Different in exactly the wrong way. Around the water trough, the soil had been churned into dark mud. Near one gate, hundreds of hooves had pressed the surface into a compacted strip. Grass that had looked healthy the day before was cropped too close in several patches. Worse, 2 younger apple trees showed fresh damage along the lower bark. Mara stood beside one of them and felt her stomach tighten. This was exactly what everyone had warned her about. Sheep were useful because they moved. But when too many animals stayed too long in one place, that same movement became pressure. Hooves could disturb the soil, then disturb it too much. Grazing could reduce competition, then remove too much protective cover. Manure could return nutrients, but sheep crowded around shade. Water or gates did not distribute themselves evenly. The system had limits, and Mara had just found one. Wade arrived before noon. He did not need to say anything. He looked at the mud, the damaged bark, and the nearly bare patches. Then he gave Mara the kind of smile people use when they believe reality has finally proven them right. "I told you." Mara kept tightening a section of temporary fence. "Told me what? That livestock and orchards don't mix." She looked toward the damaged trees. "No, you told me the sheep were useless." Wade pointed at the ground. "Looks pretty useful at ruining things." That one landed. For the rest of the afternoon, Mara moved the flock out. She relocated the trough. She protected the trunks of the youngest trees. Then she walked the damaged block alone. It would have been easy to stop there. Easy to say the experiment had failed. But the mistake had taught her something more valuable than the early success. The sheep were not the solution by themselves. Management was. It was not enough to ask what the animals could do. She had to ask how long they should do it, where they should do it, and when the land needed them gone. That evening, Mara opened her notebook. Days earlier she had written, "Sheep improve the orchard." She crossed it out. Underneath, she wrote, "Sheep can help improve the orchard if I move them before their help becomes damage." That difference changed everything. The next morning, Mara began designing the farm around movement instead of permanence. After the damage in the western block, Mara changed the question. She stopped asking, "How many sheep can this orchard hold?" Instead, she began asking, "How long should they stay before the land needs them gone?" The shift sounded small. It was not. She spent the next several days dividing the orchard into temporary paddocks with portable fencing. The sections became smaller. The moves became more frequent. Water troughs changed position instead of becoming permanent gathering points. The sheep no longer wandered wherever they wanted. They entered a section. They grazed it. Then they moved. Afterward, the ground rested. Mara began watching signs rather than relying on one fixed number. How low had the grass been eaten? Was the soil firm or soft? Were the sheep beginning to reach for vegetation they had ignored on the first day? Were they lingering around trunks? Was the ground beside the water becoming too disturbed? The moment those answers started moving in the wrong direction, Mara opened the next paddock. At first, the constant movement felt exhausting. Fence up, fence down, move water, check trees, count sheep, walk the ground, repeat. But after several weeks, Mara noticed something strange. The orchard developed a rhythm. One strip was being grazed. Another was recovering. A third had already grown enough for fresh green vegetation to return between the rows. The sheep were no longer simply removing plants. They were passing through them. That distinction mattered. Mara had learned the hard way that grazing could become damage when animals stayed too long, but with shorter occupation and longer recovery, the same flock behaved differently. They ate the most accessible forage. First they left manure behind, then they disappeared from the section before bare ground became the dominant feature. The orchard had time to respond. Wade noticed the fencing before he noticed anything else. You removing them again? Tomorrow. You moved them yesterday. Yes. He stared at Mara. That sounds like a lot of work for animals nobody wanted. Mara hooked a fence reel onto a post. It is. Wade smiled, expecting agreement. Then Mara added, but I am starting to know exactly what work they're doing. He said nothing. That was the difference now. At first, Mara had simply hoped the sheep might save money. Now she was beginning to understand the system. The animals were not magical. Their manure was not magical. Their hooves were not magical. Even grazing was not automatically beneficial. The useful part was the sequence: graze, move, rest, recover, then return only when the land was ready. By late summer, Mara's notebook no longer looked like a list of expenses. It looked like a map: dates, paddocks, rainfall, grass height, tree condition, recovery time, and beside several rows, Mara had drawn small circles. They marked places where something seemed to be changing. Not enough to prove anything. Not yet, but enough that Mara started checking the apple trees before she checked the sheep. Because the next thing she noticed was not on the ground. It was growing from the branches. The first sign was so small Mara almost missed it. It appeared on an old apple tree in row 12. The tree had a crooked trunk, scarred bark, and one damaged branch Mara had nearly cut off the previous winter. For 3 seasons, it had produced almost nothing worth picking. One late summer morning, while checking temporary fencing, Mara noticed fresh growth near the end of that branch. She stopped. The leaves looked darker, not dramatically darker. Not enough to turn the tree into proof of anything, just healthier than she remembered. Mara opened her notebook. Row 12 had been grazed twice. Both visits had been short. Afterward, the paddock had rested for weeks. She crouched beneath the tree. The ground was not bare. Short vegetation remained between old grass, fallen leaves, and scattered manure. When Mara pressed her fingers beneath the surface, the soil felt cooler than the exposed patches near the road. That did not prove the sheep had improved the tree. Mara knew better than to make that claim. Trees responded to weather. Rainfall changed, temperatures changed, roots behaved differently from place to place. One branch could improve for reasons she might never completely understand, so she tied a strip of blue cloth around the trunk and kept walking. A week later, she marked another tree. Then 2 more. What interested Mara was not any single example. It was repetition. Several trees in carefully managed sections seemed to be holding foliage better than trees in areas still crowded by dense growth. Then autumn came. The leaves dropped. Winter returned the orchard to gray trunks and bare branches. Mara had no choice but to wait. When the following spring arrived, she began walking the rows again. This time she watched the buds. Row 12 stopped her first. The crooked tree with the blue cloth carried more flower clusters than Mara remembered, seeing the year before. She stood beneath it before sunrise. White petals opened along the old branch. Mara counted several clusters, then deliberately closed the notebook. One tree still proved almost nothing, but it was no longer alone. Another marked tree bloomed, then another. By the time the strongest spring flowers opened, blue cloth appeared throughout several rotationally grazed sections. Wade found Mara beneath row 12. What are you looking at? She pointed upward. Bloom, he shrugged. Apple trees bloom, not that one. Wade looked again. For once, he did not laugh. Mara did not tell him the sheep had brought the tree back. She could not prove that. What she could say was simpler. The environment beneath parts of the orchard had changed. Dense competition had been reduced. Vegetation was being managed differently. Manure was being returned across the ground, and Mara was observing each section more carefully than she ever had before. The orchard remained uneven. Some trees were still weak. Some would probably never recover, but the place no longer looked completely finished. Mara had also learned enough not to ask whether one good branch meant the orchard was saved. She asked something harder. Would the pattern repeat? By midsummer, Mara noticed another change. She was buying less hay, not dramatically. Not enough to stop watching every dollar, but enough that she noticed. The flock was spending more of its time grazing beneath the apple trees, moving from paddock to paddock as vegetation recovered behind it. For the first time, Mara stopped thinking of the grass between the rows as a maintenance problem. It was forage. The orchard was feeding the sheep, and the sheep were returning part of that forage to the orchard as manure. The loop was becoming visible. Sunlight grew vegetation. The sheep ate part of it. Their manure fell back onto the soil. Then the paddock rested and grew again. It was not a perfect circle. Nothing on a farm was. Nutrients could leave the system. Dry weather could slow regrowth. Old sheep still needed care. Some animals required more attention than others. Poorly timed grazing could still cause damage. But Mara was beginning to see something she had missed for years. The farm already produced resources. She had simply been paying to remove some of them. Before the flock arrived, every flush of vegetation meant another pass with the mower, another tank of diesel, another afternoon lost to maintenance. Now that same growth had a second purpose. Mara began measuring it differently. Which paddocks recovered fastest? Which sections stayed green longer? Which rows provided enough forage to move the sheep through without immediately reaching for supplemental feed? Some blocks performed poorly. Others surprised her. One low section near the eastern fence stayed green well into dry weather. The sheep always reached it eagerly. Mara marked it in her notebook. Not because it was the prettiest part of the orchard. Because it kept producing. She was learning that the land did not behave evenly. A system built around movement could respond to those differences, instead of pretending all 23 acres were identical. One afternoon, Wade stood beside a stack of hay bales. "You ordering less this year?" A little he looked toward the orchard. Because of those trees? Because of what's under them? Wade followed her gaze. The sheep were grazing quietly between the rows. "You mean the weeds?" Mara smiled. "I used to call them that too." That answer irritated him more than an argument would have. He shook his head and walked away. Mara stayed by the fence. The orchard had not suddenly become profitable. The sheep had not become valuable breeding animals. But the relationship between the two had changed. The orchard provided part of the flock's feed. The flock helped manage the orchard floor. Each reduced a cost the other had once created. That was when Mara realized the experiment had become something larger than a cheap substitute for mowing. It was becoming a system. And once a farm starts turning one problem into an input for another, the numbers begin to change. Not all at once, but enough to make people look twice. By fall, people had mostly stopped laughing at the orchard, but some were still laughing at the sheep. To most ranchers, the flock had not changed. The old ewes were still old. The undersized animals were still undersized. The ones with poor fleece had not suddenly become valuable wool producers. The stiff-legged ewe still moved carefully between the rows. If Mara tried to sell the flock at market, nobody would have mistaken them for premium livestock. Wade reminded her of that whenever he could. "You know what your problem is?" he said one afternoon. Mara was repairing temporary fencing beside the south block. "I've got several. Which one you confusing usefulness with value?" Mara looked up. Wade pointed toward the sheep. "They useful to you, because they eat grass. Fine, but that does to make them worth anything." Mara leaned against the fence post. "What makes something worth something? What somebody will pay for it." "That all?" Wade frowned to a rancher. "Mostly." Mara looked beyond him toward the orchard. That answer would have made perfect sense to her a year earlier. A sheep's value was lambs. Wool, meat, breeding stock. A tree's value was boxes of apples. Grass between orchard rows had no value at all. It was simply something that needed cutting. But the farm was showing Mara another kind of accounting. The sheep were replacing part of the mowing. They were turning freely grown vegetation into part of their feed. Their manure was being distributed across the orchard floor. The orchard, in turn, was reducing part of the cost of feeding them during the growing season. None of that appeared on a livestock auction sheet. But it appeared in Mara's expenses that winter. She sat at the kitchen table with 2 years of receipts spread in front of her. Diesel mower repairs, purchased feed, labor fencing, veterinary care. She was not suddenly rich. Not even close. Some costs had gone up. Managing the flock required portable fencing, water equipment, time, and constant attention. But other costs were moving in the opposite direction. Mara circled the numbers. The experiment had not made the sheep more valuable as sheep. It had made them valuable as part of something larger. That was the piece Wade had missed. He was still asking the old question. What can this animal produce that I can sell? Mara was asking another. What expensive job can this animal perform while remaining healthy? The distinction changed everything. A week later, 2 ranchers stopped by after hearing about the orchard. They inspected the trees, then the flock. Finally, one asked, "What breed are these?" "Mixed." The man looked disappointed. "So there's nothing special about them?" Mara glanced at the animals moving beneath the trees. "No," she smiled. "That's the point." The ranchers exchanged a look. Everyone kept asking what these sheep were worth at market, Mara continued. She pointed toward the managed rows. I started asking what they could replace. No one laughed for the first time. The animals nobody had wanted were being judged by a different standard, not by what they could become, by what they could do. The next spring arrived slowly. Cold mornings lingered. And for several weeks the orchard looked almost exactly as it always had during winter. Gray trunks, bare branches, rows of grass just beginning to wake. Mara refused to predict what would happen. The previous year had given her encouraging signs, but signs were not a harvest. One healthier branch did not save a tree. A handful of blooming trees did not restore an orchard. And one favorable season could make almost any experiment look smarter than it really was. So when the buds began swelling, Mara opened her notebook and started walking. Row 1. Row 2. Row 3. She checked trees. She had marked with blue cloth. Some looked ordinary. One had lost a branch during winter. Several remained weak. Then Mara reached row 12. And stopped. The old crooked tree was covered in buds, not a few scattered clusters like the previous spring. Dozens, tight pink buds crowded along branches that had once looked almost empty. Mara stepped closer. She did not celebrate. She kept walking. Row 13 showed the same improvement. Then part of row 15, another managed block farther east, carried stronger bud development than Mara expected. By the end of the morning, the pattern covered enough trees that she could no longer dismiss everything as one lucky branch. The orchard had not recovered uniformly. Some sections remained poor. Some trees would still need to be removed, but something had shifted. A week later, the flowers opened. White blossoms appeared through the orchard in uneven waves. The strongest bloom was not everywhere. It followed certain rows where the ground had been managed differently, rows where the sheep had passed through and then moved on, rows that had repeatedly received recovery time. Mara knew better than to claim the sheep had single-handedly brought the orchard back. Weather mattered, rain mattered, pruning mattered, tree age mattered. So did every management decision she had made along the way. But the orchard floor no longer looked like a neglected battlefield. It functioned differently. Vegetation was controlled without being continuously scalped. The flock passed through instead of remaining long enough to strip the ground. Part of the forage returned through manure, and the trees were no longer standing above a permanent wall of unmanaged growth. Wade arrived on a warm morning. He stopped his truck at the fence and remained inside for several seconds. From the road, parts of the orchard looked almost white. Finally, he climbed out. What happened? Mara stood beneath one of the blooming trees. Spring, Wade stared across the rows. You know what I mean, Mara did. For nearly 2 years, he had watched the experiment as if waiting for the mistake that would finally end it. Now thousands of blossoms hung above the ground where unwanted sheep had been moving from paddock to paddock. He reached toward one flower. So the sheep did this? Mara shook her head. No, that surprised him. She looked beneath the branches. They were part of changing how I managed this place. That mattered more. The sheep were not a cure. Their manure was not a cure. Rotational grazing was not a magic switch capable of reversing every problem inside an aging orchard. The bloom was beautiful, but Mara did not trust beauty. Flowers were only a promise. They still had to survive. They had to be pollinated. Fruit had to set. Branches had to hold. So when the petals finally began drifting into the grass, Mara stopped watching the flowers. She began watching the places where they had been. For the next 2 weeks, Mara searched the branches without allowing herself to expect anything. The blossoms were gone. White petals had browned and disappeared into the grass. Now came the part that mattered. A tree could bloom heavily and still produce almost nothing. A cold night could ruin flowers. Poor pollination could leave branches empty. Heat could thin the fruit. Disease could take the rest. The orchard had disappointed her too many times for Mara to mistake blossoms for apples. So every morning, she walked, row 12 first. Then the surrounding blocks. At the beginning there was almost nothing to see. Then one morning, Mara leaned toward a branch on the old crooked tree and stopped. Something green sat where one flower had been. A tiny apple, no larger than the end of her thumb. Mara touched it carefully. Then she looked farther along the branch. Another. And another. She moved to the next branch. More. By the time she reached the end of row 12, counting individual fruit no longer felt useful. The apples were setting. Mara opened her notebook. 2 years earlier, she had recorded several of those trees as low-producing. Now she wrote a single word beside row 12, holding. The fruit was holding. Other rows followed. Not all of them. Some trees still carried only a few apples. Several weak trees produced nothing. Other branches shed part of their young fruit as the season progressed. The orchard was not transforming into a perfect commercial photograph. That made what remained more convincing to Mara. This was not a miracle appearing everywhere at once. It was an uneven recovery. Through early summer, the apples grew as the crop became more valuable. Mara became more cautious with the sheep. She shortened grazing periods near heavily loaded trees. She protected vulnerable trunks. She watched low branches carefully. Water points continued moving. The system had entered another stage. Before, Mara had been trying to save the orchard. Now she had something worth protecting. By August, patches of red began appearing through the leaves. Wade stopped at the fence one afternoon and stared for several seconds. He said nothing. Then he climbed out of his truck. "You got apples?" Mara smiled. "Looks that way." They walked toward row 12. The old crooked tree stood ahead of them, carrying more fruit than either of them remembered seeing on it in years. Wade reached toward an apple and stopped. "You going to tell me those sheep did this?" Mara shook her head. No, this time he looked almost disappointed. They didn't make rainfall. They didn't prune the trees. They didn't pollinate the flowers." Mara looked toward the flock grazing several rows away. "But they helped change how this place works." Wade studied the orchard. For once he seemed to understand the distinction. The sheep had never been a miracle cure. They were one piece of a larger system. They turned vegetation into forage. They reduced part of the mowing. They returned manure to the ground. Their need for controlled movement forced Mara to divide the orchard into smaller sections. And that forced her to observe differences she had ignored for years. By harvest, Mara filled the first wooden crate before noon. Then another, then another. The crop was not record-breaking. It did not erase her debt. It did not transform every damaged tree. But the orchard people had already called finished was producing again. A few days later, Dale Harlan, the rancher who had sold Mara the unwanted flock, pulled into the driveway. He looked at the apples, then the orchard, then the sheep. "What breed did you say these were?" Mara laughed. "You know what breed they are." Dale smiled. "Then what changed?" Mara picked up an apple from one of the crates. The job. Everyone wanted them to make money by being better sheep. She looked toward the orchard. "I needed them to help me build a better farm." Behind her, nearly 100 animals no rancher had wanted moved quietly beneath branches carrying fruit. And for the first time, nobody standing there called them useless. By the end of harvest, the orchard still did not look perfect. That mattered to Mara. Some trees remained thin. A few had to be cut down. Several rows produced less than she hoped. The old irrigation system still leaked in 2 places. The sheep still needed fencing, water, veterinary attention, and more daily management than Wade thought they were worth. Nothing had turned into a miracle, but the farm was working again. Crates of apples stood beneath the shed roof. Grass was returning in paddocks the sheep had already left. The flock moved quietly through the final sections of the orchard, heads down beneath branches that had carried fruit only weeks before. Mara stood at the edge of the field and watched them. 2 years earlier, nearly everything she was looking at had been judged by what it failed to do. The orchard failed because it did not produce enough apples. The sheep failed because they did not produce enough lambs, wool, or market value. The grass failed because everyone saw it only as a weed problem. Even the farm itself had been described as something requiring more money than it could return. But all those judgments had been made separately. That was the mistake. The orchard had vegetation. The sheep needed forage. The vegetation needed management. The soil needed nutrients returned to it. The trees needed less competition and better care. One problem had been sitting beside another problem the entire time. They simply had not been connected. Wade came by near sunset. He leaned against the fence without saying much. The last light caught a few remaining apples high in the branches. Below them, the old ewes moved slowly through the grass. Wade finally nodded toward the flock. "You keeping all of them?" Mara smiled. "As long as they still have a job." He looked toward the orchard, and when they don't, Mara thought about it. "Then I'll find out what they can still do." Wade laughed quietly. It was the first time his laughter did not sound like ridicule. For a while, neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to prove that evening. The apples had already done enough. Not because the sheep had magically healed the land. Not because manure alone had saved the trees. And not because Mara had discovered some secret nobody else understood. She had simply stopped asking the same question everyone else had been asking. "What is this worth instead?" she asked. "What can this do here?" That question changed the orchard, it changed the flock, and somewhere along the way it changed Mara too. She no longer looked at an old animal and saw only declining production. She no longer looked at grass and saw only something that needed cutting. She no longer looked at a damaged tree and automatically decided its best years were behind it. Value. Mara had learned, depended on relationship. A thing could be nearly worthless in one system and essential in another. The sheep had not become younger. They had not become better breeding stock. Their wool had not suddenly become premium. What changed was the role they were being asked to perform. The orchard had not become young again either. Some trees would always be weak. Some would eventually disappear, but the land around them was being managed with purpose instead of simply being fought. The sun slipped behind the western ridge. Mara opened the gate to the next paddock. The sheep hesitated for only a moment. Then they moved through, slowly. Quietly, their heads lowered toward the vegetation beneath the trees. Above them, apple branches rustled in the evening wind. 2 years earlier, Wade had looked at the same orchard and seen firewood. Ranchers had looked at the same sheep and seen feed bills. Mara had looked at the grass and seen another mowing expense. None of those observations had been completely wrong. They had simply been incomplete. Maybe useless had never described the sheep at all. Maybe it was only the word people used when they had stopped imagining another purpose.